I guess we'll start with a brief summary of Inscryption, since it starts with you continuing someone else's game. The game begins in Leshy's cabin as he puts you through an incomplete tutorial of his version of the game. You eventually get to interact with a few talking cards, his rival scribes, that he has locked behind various puzzles that you can find once you're allowed to explore the cabin. You're allowed to explore the cabin after your first forced loss. Realistically, you're forced to lose at least 3 times. The first will introduce a live system, the second will show you a different summoning mechanic and death cards, and the third is just redundancy. While collecting the talking cards, one of them will reveal a plan to defeat Leshy and reset the game. Eventually, beating Leshy at his game with the talking cards and a film roll will allow you to trap Leshy within his own death card, using his camera against him. Within this backroom, where you've been creating your death cards, is the new game option, and interacting with it restores it back to the main menu. The game then transitions to a pixelated overworld. Here, all 4 of the scribes control their own respective domain and have their own implement to create cards. Leshy, with his camera, will capture beast cards. Grimora, with her quill, inscribes undead cards. P03, with his particle scanner, manufactures technology cards. And Magnificus, with his brush, paints magic cards. You arrive in this world to replace one of them, selecting a starter deck of cards and being allowed to challenge them almost however you like. Half of the world is cut off from you until you either defeat Leshy or Grimora. Then you're able to explore the world as much as you like. Eventually, after defeating all the scribes and their followers, you go back to where you started and choose a scribe to replace. Regardless of who you choose, they force P03 to take their place. P03 will play a corrupt piece of the code known as the old data, and this will crash the game. The game then reformats itself, restarting now with P03 in his factory in control, similar to Leshy in his cabin. He runs you through a similar game that is not too different from the pixelated overworld version of it, but this one is more focused on his style of cards and use of energy to summon bots. Eventually, things from other parts of the game bleed into the factory, adding additional puzzles for you to solve. P03 will then eventually task you with investigating a damaged camera in his factory, and this is where you meet the other scribes. They've put their differences aside for the sake of stopping P03's plan, called the Great Transcendence. They ask you to keep playing with him, so that when he thinks he's won, Leshy will be able to strike. At the end of P03's game, it's revealed you've only just been helping him set up a store page for Inscryption Online, with each of the boss's mechanics. As he's uploading the game to the internet, Leshy comes from behind to rip his head off, which stops the upload. Leshy and Magnificus are content with giving you the new game card, resetting the game back to the pixelated section, but Grimora accesses the files of the game and begins deleting everything. The game ends with you playing a short game with each scribe before they are eventually deleted. The main issue with the characters of Inscryption is they often work against their own goals to push some other aspect of the game. Leshy, for example, should want to maintain control over the game as long as possible, and keep you playing his game as long as possible. The game being locked up in the woods with nobody for him to play with seems to be something that he's aware of. I don't know why you would then place roadblocks against your player to keep them from progressing. If it's meant to introduce death cards and the other summoning mechanic, those should just be incorporated into the tutorial. Show the player the other summoning mechanic in a mock battle, and then at the end of the tutorial have them make a death card, so then they can move on to the main game. Forcing you to reset needlessly because your deck or playstyle are really pushing you through the game quickly is a needless punishment on the player. It's like an invisible wall that just goes away if you come back later. There's also no reason for him to allow you access to the other scribes that are locked away on those talking cards, which are in puzzles around his cabin. If anything, they should be put somewhere else where the player can't even interact with them. Leshy ultimately does the best at keeping the other scribes away from the player, but he still fails to do so because if he had locked them away competently, the game would have to fundamentally change. Your interactions with the other scribes is the only way you get the spare camera roll and weaponize Leshy's camera against him. There's also no reason that the new game option should be in his back room if he's going to take you back there every time you need to reset your run. I don't know why you would risk taking the player within a room's distance of the one thing that can remove your power over the game. If that's the only place he could hide it within his cabin, it shouldn't be freely left back there for anyone to restore the game with. P03 is the other scribe you spend most of your time with. He still has, if not worse, failings than Leshy for the sake of the story continuing. Leshy at the very least had the other scribes confined to cards, and he technically locked them away behind puzzles. P03 just puts them somewhere in his factory, and he expects them not to try and stop him? If he had done anything at all to restrain them, they wouldn't have been able to stop his plan, or interact with you. He also has you locked to the playing table, only letting you go once he needs a new battery for you to continue playing. If instead of letting you free here, he goes to get the battery himself, you also aren't allowed to interact with the scribes and help them stop P03, although they could ultimately do that without you. As for his plan, for the most part it makes sense. He connects himself to your hard drive, internet, gathers screenshots, and has you create a boss so he can sell Inscryption to as many people as possible. For some reason, he doesn't think he'll be in charge of every single one of the copies, but he will be in most of them? I don't know how he can make any deduction on who would be in charge of each version of Inscryption that gets sold. He should either be copying this version of the game, the version with him in control, and selling that version as Inscryption, or be copying the base game, which means there's a 1 in 4 chance in each of those copies he's actually going to be in charge. Being in control of at least 25% of the copies of the game is nowhere near most of the games. We don't get that much time with Magnificus to flesh out his character. He's the smartest of them, knowing that P03 is plotting something in the pixelated overworld version of the game. But then he immediately negates this by, like the other scribes, having P03 take his place in the final battle. If P03 is planning something, you should realistically be doing everything possible to stop him from advancing that plan that you know nothing about. His plan could involve the player, who is someone who knows nothing of your intricate power struggles, and will just simply allow the plan to come to fruition. He should have anyone else take his place in that final battle, or at the very least, just have the final battle with you. The player is simply an unknown variable. There's no reason to allow them to interact with P03. If you don't know what P03 is planning, then you should be limiting and trying to restrict what actions he could take, not adding to them. Grimora is probably one of the worst characters, mostly because of the role the game makes her take to get to the finale. She is meant to be exhausted with their endless power struggle occurring, but this is only told to you through a different character. She talks briefly of wishing to free them all from the torturous cycles, and granting them all freedom through deletion, but this is not enough setup. For one, it happens only if you choose to replace her at the end of the pixelated overworld in the final battle. This dialogue is entirely optional, since you can choose to replace any of those scribes in the final battle. Secondly, this is not portrayed in her actions. Her tomb is still full of puzzles, she is excited to play with you, she doesn't even come close to lamenting the old data or the situation it created. If you don't get her optional dialogue, she only briefly touches on this in the finale, which I don't think is earned. Essentially, Grimora kills everyone, destroying their entire world because she's tired of the endless cycles. She doesn't discuss this with anyone, she just does it. It's reckless and stupid. You don't know that doing this will stop the old data from existing, or if the game's very code was helping muddle or suppress the old data. It certainly doesn't seem to have its full power throughout the game. The old data is, ironically, consistently inconsistent throughout the game. It allows any scribe who finds a fragment of it to rewrite the game itself, but never an absolute rewrite. P03's factory in particular is an odd indicator of the old data's inconsistency. P03 rewrites the game for his factory to be the sole focus, but there's still an overlap of other scribes' items and puzzles into his factory. Leshy's clock puzzle and one of Magnificus's puzzles bleed over into the factory. But then at the same time, none of the puzzles in the factory, Grimora's crypt, or Magnificus's tower ever bleed into Leshy's cabin. The only thing that consistently bleeds over would be Goobert, but Goobert hardly facilitates much more than interesting dialogue. He doesn't add much to any of the locations he's ever involved in. There's a hint in Leshy's cabin, but that's not necessarily tied to him, rather the place that he gets put in the cabin. Realistically, that hint doesn't hinge on Goobert being placed there or not. It's written into the area around him. There's a small interaction with Goobert in P03's factory, but it only concerns him and how he feels about Magnificus. Nothing that really involves Goobert directly alters any portion of the game. While Leshy's clock bleeding into the factory ultimately grants you just cards to use, it never really occurs at Leshy's cabin. There's no control panel or tombstone puzzle that ever bleeds over into the cabin. Magnificus's dead body in the back room explains how Leshy gets a hold of his eye and how Magnificus was able to paint clues around the cabin to help you. So the old data didn't allow for bleeding of other items into Leshy's cabin, and there's no reason for it to do so in the factory. It just does. The old data supposedly has an evil contrived force within it, and also has the launch codes to destroy half of Europe. If it's true, why doesn't that evil force just activate the code? The most I could say in defense of the entity is that the old data is related to the Karnoffel code, so it might not entirely just have the pure launch code. It's hard to know since what the Karnoffel code is doesn't get touched on until Casey's mod, and it's only briefly to tell us of its destructive power in relation to the old data. Casey, Luke, and Amanda are all characters outside the game, but they have a storyline somewhat related to the old data. Casey originally gets the game through her job at Game Funa. While in her possession, Leshy manages to get a hold of the old data and gain control of the game. She then grows to love Leshy's version of the game, but mods it to make it more balanced in her view. After some time, she learns about the old data through a character called the Woodcarver and uncovers what it can do. She gets a call from the man who previously had the floppy disk, Mr. Kaminsky, who she writes off as insane. There's a moment where she contemplates throwing the disk into some nearby water, but decides against it. In her last log, she decides to bury the disk out in the woods, where Luke finds it, and writes the coordinates for it on an Inscryption card and seals the pack again. She's undecided if she'll ever go back for it or just leave it there. Either way, she dies at a fire at a Game Funa facility, and her mother ends up selling those Inscryption cards to Luke. The only problem with Casey's story is really the final log. If you know how destructive the old data can be, there's no reason to go bury it somewhere in the woods. That's probably the worst solution to having a world-destroying weapon in your hands. It's almost impossible to know what happens to it now that you buried it in the middle of the woods. Yeah, you could go back and get it, but why would you even place it somewhere that you can't even keep an eye on it? You know how destructive it can be, but you treat it like it's some trinket that doesn't have any world-destroying consequences. At the very least, from Casey's perspective, there's one person who really wants the disc, and that's Mr. Kaminsky. If you really think he's crazy, burying the thing he wants out in the middle of the woods would not help the situation if he was able to find you. Even the way she keeps track of the coordinates is idiotic. I can't think of a situation where writing it on a playing card is more convenient than putting it on a different storage disk, or keeping a personal note on yourself somehow. It's done this way simply so Luke can get a hold of the game and its location. Speaking of, Luke is a waste of a character most of the time. He's meant to be the player character, but it's so hard to relate to him. He's set up as you open the game, but only with one line, and then he's not seen or heard from till the end of Leshy's cabin, or the first time you beat Leshy. This is a long time to play by yourself without any input from the protagonist of the game. Looking over most of Luke's contributions to the story, however, this was probably the best choice. Having more of Luke in the game would probably make it worse. He tends to know just weird things and make irrational choices that are really stupid, while mainly quipping throughout the story. As an example, the only reason Luke gets Inscryption is in part because Casey wrote the coordinates of where she hid it on one of the cards she owned. It would be perfectly fine for Luke to want to look up those coordinates, but he says he's pretty sure those coordinates are close to his house. This is just a weird statement. I can't think of a single person who can estimate the coordinates of their house or estimate how close something is to their house based on said coordinates. Another strange decision Luke makes is when he emails GameFuna, the company who owns the Inscryption IP. He reads out the exchange to his camera, which is fine. I understand wanting to document everything that's going on to a degree, but recording it might be an inefficient way to do so. The exchange amounts to Luke asking if GameFuna has anything to do with an Inscryption game that he found, GameFuna saying no, and asking him to mail the game to them since it violates some legal codes they cite, and they would wish to not legally challenge him for the game. Luke shows no consideration for what they've said, basically. He simply says,
"What the fuck?"
If at this point he's meant to not believe GameFuna's response, or playing the game has tainted his mind, it's not shown. He just doesn't trust them because... It's even more confusing since they've sponsored his channel in the past, and supposedly they're on good terms. The most obvious choice here is to make Luke at least consider the idea, if not because of his relationship with the company, for the potential legal ramifications they've cited. Luke's later interaction with one of the company employees coming to his house is more understandable. She shows up at his house and starts asking about the copy of Inscryption he emailed GameFuna about, mostly deflecting away from any questions he wants to ask. His what the fuck response is more understandable now. He mentions to the camera that this woman also came the day before and he just didn't answer, and now he's had a very vague, threatening interaction with her. Still, his previous what the fuck moment feels rushed. It would be better if he had not received an email from GameFuna until after the employee had arrived unannounced at his house. This would justify his response to the email sent by GameFuna much better. There's also a section where someone breaks into his house, and he chooses to confront them with no visible weapon. This is just a dumb idea, even though he states his phone is in the other room. He then records some piece of paper on the floor with some code on it, which is weird. If the implication is meant to be whoever broke in is recording it, it's unclear. As far as the context given to this video clip following Luke's supposed confrontation with the intruder, it's Luke doing it for some reason. There's also a boss from P03's factory that wants to add files from your hard drive to the scales, adding damage based on their size and later on their age. Obviously, we can't use preset files from Luke's hard drive because that would be interesting. Another video has Luke calling Casey's mom Miss Hobbs. She's the woman who sold him the cards with the Inscryption coordinates on them. This scene is shot really poorly. Luke has to repeat everything that he's told so we can understand what's happening. The phone simply couldn't have been on speaker, or Miss Hobbs couldn't have been louder so we can understand her. Luke just has to do this very odd behavior to let us know what's happening. This is another weird choice, like Luke knowing the coordinates on the card are relatively close to his house, that is obviously to advance the story and inform us. That same boss looking at your hard drive will simply scatter Luke's files all around the map, and when looked at them, they reveal that Luke has a dead sister. This doesn't really play into the story much, making me think that this is simply a sympathy grab. It might explain his obsession with card games. It shows his sister and him winning a tournament before she passed, but with no input from Luke, it's hard to know for certain. It's a major problem with Luke throughout the game. There's many things throughout the game he could comment on, either to connect him more with the player or to add context to things happening around him, but he just doesn't. The majority of his voice lines, while not in the video clips, are clips. The problem with the video clips is also how forced they are. There are 3 batches of videos, and they cut into the middle of the game, each one in a different section. It would be understandable if each video section happened before the next section of the game, but his camera falling over, running out of battery, and running out of storage is just all manufactured so we can cut to a selection of video clips. Also, why aren't they all available at once? It's all being uploaded to the same place. I don't know why at least chunks of the previous footage are never available. Especially since the events of you playing Inscryption don't really line up with his footage dates at all. You could very well play the whole game in one sitting, but Luke's story happens over the course of 2 months, which also confuses the ending of his story. Luke, having seen the old data at the game's deletion, supposedly breaks down and tries to destroy the floppy disk. There's an unknown amount of time that passes before Luke tries to contact a reporter and expose GameFuna for whatever the old data is. There's then a knock at his door, which is obviously the GameFuna employee again. She kills him, hangs up the phone, and takes the disc before leaving. Over the course of the 2 months of recording, Luke records a break-in, a GameFuna employee pressuring him to hand over Inscryption, and has done some research into the death of Casey, who worked at GameFuna. I think at the very least, with those and the recent oddities in his life, he should have been in a public place to make the call to the reporter. Even better would be for him to just go to the journalist he's calling in person. Why even risk something else happening before you can give your full story to somebody? All this video recording has clearly gone to waste because he doesn't send it to anyone, which was the obvious thing to do. I don't understand the point of documenting everything if it's never going to amount to anything. It's just a wasted point that we use to give Luke character and story relevance in a lazy way. Amanda is the GameFuna employee trying to get Inscryption and the old data from Luke. Ultimately, there's not enough screen time with her to flesh out a full character, but the actions that she's going to take throughout the story are just stupid. When she's talking to Luke, she doesn't say anything that would keep suspicion off her. For example, she's evasive when Luke wants to know how she got on his property despite his gate being locked, but then she bluntly says where she got his address from. All her responses do is make her job harder, and it's arguable that she's very incompetent. It's assumed that she broke into Luke's house during one of his lore dumps and somehow couldn't find the disc. Luke had to order a special drive to even run the game since it's on a floppy disk, and she didn't see that for some reason. Either that or Luke had been storing it somewhere else in the house, in which case I don't know why she would take the time then to bug his phones. It's the only way she can know what he's discussing during the finale of the game and return to the house to kill him and take the disc. At any other point in the story she could have also done that, by the way. It would have been safer. Now Luke has vaguely told his story to someone, and they might want to dig a little deeper into it, since he just randomly scheduled an appointment and hung up in the middle of it. If at any other point earlier in the story she had simply killed him and ransacked the house for the disc, there would also not be a third party lightly aware of Luke's predicament, which puts Amanda's goals at risk. And while the characters are often compromised in service of the story, I think the biggest problem with the game is the advertising. There's almost nothing on the Steam page showcasing anything but Leshy's cabin. One of the 2 trailers shows the second act in the finale of the game for a moment, and it also shows Luke for a little bit, but the cabin is still the main focus of the trailer. I think it's fair for anyone to assume that the game and the story is going to revolve around this cabin, but it doesn't. Realistically, Leshy's cabin is just one of 3 acts. It's unfair to showcase the cabin almost exclusively. Anyone looking over the game, on Steam at least, would reasonably come to the conclusion that Inscryption revolves around this atmospheric cabin. I don't expect anyone who's going to pick up the game to do an extensive dive into the game beforehand to know all of this. It's false advertising. But more pressing is how Casey's mod is presented by the developer. The post stating the beta opening of Casey's mod says, "I have received countless requests for an endlessly playable version of Part 1 that emphasizes Leshy's deck-building roguelike as a standalone experience. That's what Casey's mod is, and a little more." Casey's mod is a free mini-expansion for Inscryption that hacks Leshy's cabin into an endless and increasingly challenging roguelike. Apply different skulls to your run to ascend the challenge levels. Reaching new levels unlocks new cards, challenges, and devlogs inscribed by the late Casey Hobbs as she uncovers the secrets on the disc. And a post 3 months later, when Casey's mod is finished, also states the same thing. But as an endless mode would imply that your run can go on forever, Casey's mod doesn't. It's a strict rerun of Leshy's cabin, the only difference being that you can choose to make the game more challenging. And by doing so you get Casey's lore from subsequent challenge levels. This is not an endless mode. It's more apt to call this a challenge mode. There are added changes to Casey's mod, sure, but if anything, that only confuses the power level of the old data. This supposedly all-powerful code that allows the scribes to rewrite the game with anything they want can be subverted because a woman can mod the game? Leshy actively despises Goobert, and yet he's given an exclusive event within Casey's mod. She balances the game, as stated in one of her lore logs, despite Leshy having made the game the way he wanted with the old data. All this does is confuse the power levels going around within the game's story, and is also highly annoying to learn about. By all means, these challenges are not easy. And the reward is a screen of text for each level you beat. It's honestly annoying to lock important story moments behind challenges and little tasks to complete. Honestly, I feel like the game doesn't have a right to call itself story-rich on Steam. Is the concept of the story interesting? Yeah, but I don't think anyone's really chasing it down. The story is fragmented and hidden in a way that people aren't really going to look for it. As of right now, there's a fetch quest in P03's factory that reveals parts of the old data and its relation to Inscryption. Only about 16% of players who have gotten the game on Steam have done this. The furthest I made it into Casey's mod before trusting the wiki properly transcribed her logs was to challenge 4 of 12. Only 11.2% of people have gotten there, and only 5.5% of people have finished all 12 levels. I think it's fair to say that if large chunks of your story are optional to obtain, and most people are not doing so, the game is not story-rich. The story being hidden behind Easter eggs, challenges, and certain interactions with characters, if anything, makes the story seem like it's starved from most of the game. Inscryption is particularly frustrating. The gameplay itself and the art is really interesting. It's not hard to see why people like this game. What's frustrating is the uncritical look at the story, at the characters, and how the game was pushed. In any other instance, if this had happened under a AAA studio, for example, these are things people would be thinking about. All these things would be heavily scrutinized over. People would be calling out that this game is pushing a false image of itself. But it all gets a pass, and it's just not fair. This game could have been better. It should have been. And in the end, it just became a mangled mess peddling itself as something greater.